So that's what he says, and what we have here is the record of an educational system that was part of a complete system of religious discipline. Gravity, intense respect for the scholar, compassion by the scholar for the student. All of this made the madrasa itself a kind of place of spiritual purgation and purification. One left the madrasa on graduating, receiving one's ijazah, not just as a more informed person, but as a luminous person. The kind of individual produced by these madaris was a kind person, compassionate person, and a sainted person. Non-Muslims who travelled in the traditional Muslim world when these institutions were still functioning in the classical way did sometimes have the perspicacity to remark upon the kind of individual generated by these places. Herman Melville, who spent some time in Turkey, writes in his great novel Moby Dick that the great white whale ploughing through the ocean recalled nothing so much as the white-bearded mufti of Constantinople, whose bearing and dignity allowed him to pass serenely through the crowds of the Turkish capital as the masses parted in awe and respect in his presence. Probably that's all I need to say about the akhlaq, the ethics that pertain to traditional Islamic education. The best way of taking this further is actually to see it for oneself and to observe the exquisite good manners that prevail in the company of the ulama and the important role that their families play in their task. Particularly now that many ulama are teaching in their own homes, it's always touching to see, as I saw many times with the Yemeni and Mauritanian ulama, that even small children are integrated into the process of education, and that the sheikh will say to a 5-year-old or a 6-year-old son, we're discussing this issue, please look it up for me in this, that or the other book, and the little boy will trot off and he'll pull it off the shelf, and then the sheikh will say, I think it's in the chapter such and such, or it's on page 346 somewhere in the bottom left-hand corner of the page, and the little boy will find it and then reverently bring it to his father, very pleased with himself and integrated in an unproblematic way into the whole project of education and learning much in the process. Very different model to that which prevails in the modern West, where the children of academics are generally largely ignorant of what their parents are doing. But this still does exist, alhamdulillah, and in a sense necessarily it exists because only using these methods can Islam be transmitted fully. An Islam that is transmitted to us by any means other than the authentic Islamic method is not going to be true Islamic knowledge, because in a sense the medium is the message. So that a scholar who has a degree in hadith from a Western style university, and almost all the Islamic universities now, including the universities in Saudi Arabia and the Gulf and Turkey, are Western style universities with classrooms and examination systems and degrees aping the Western system, the BA, the MA, the PhD. That scholar, that graduate, is not an alim in anything like the traditional sense, and cannot be. Any comparison of somebody who has studied in the traditional Muslim system and somebody who is a product of the mass education Western systems favoured now by so many modern Muslim jurisdictions will reveal the extraordinary impoverishment that has taken place. Not just in terms of how much these people actually know, but also in terms of their quality. Because a classroom where the lecturer is standing in glory behind a lectern and the students are sitting behind desks where there is a blackboard, where there is a bell, where there is a Western-style system of assessment, is not following the Sunnah, even if the Sunnah is being taught. Remember Tashka Prezada's point that the lecturer has to exemplify the subject that he's teaching. The intention behind the establishment of these universities was in most cases a positive one. It wasn't an intention to subvert. But the reality has been a massive decline in the quality of the output of these institutions, with a concomitant negative consequence for society at large. In some Muslim countries, the system has been bureaucratized to such an extent that virtually the entire corpus of ulama that's now being generated is palpably intellectually second-rate. In Jordan, for instance, and Jordan is not the only country to have this absurd system, it is very difficult for a school graduate to choose what he or she will study at university. What you study at university depends on your examination results from school. If you do really well, you're allowed into the Faculty of Medicine, a prestigious profession. If you do not quite so well, then you become an engineer. And if you do really badly, then you go into Sharia. And that's the law in Jordan. The result, of course, has to be a mosque leadership, a religious leadership that is despised by the bulk of the population, that has very little self-esteem, and that simply does not have, in most cases, I don't say in all cases, the intellectual resources necessary to deal with the problems confronting Muslims as they interact with the modern world. So our system has become westernized and has become decadent simultaneously, whatever the intention might have been. But the good news is that the traditional system doesn't cost anything. That's the beauty of it, because of its origins in the experience of the Salaf. People who had institutions that didn't cost anything because they couldn't afford anything. You can instruct a classical alim to the highest degree without spending a penny, because the mosque is already there. You teach in the mosque. You don't need an administration, you don't need secretaries with computers, you don't need degree certificates, you don't need anything at all. There is no paraphernalia accompanying traditional Islamic education. All you need is the human beings and a space. So it's a very flexible, dynamic, organic system, and one that can, for that reason, inshallah, be easily resuscitated. It's much easier to create an Islamic educational setting than it is to create a Western intellectual academic setting. And inshallah, what we're now seeing even in the West with initiatives such as the Zaytuna Institute and a number of others, some in Spain, some in the United Kingdom, is the first move towards the reclamation of the most impressive and successful and glorious educational system that the world has ever seen. And because the model is Sayyidina Rasulullah sallallahu alayhi wasallam, who didn't have a blackboard, who didn't have anything, it's easy to implement. The poorest communities can do it. All we need is the desire to learn and the desire to teach and something to teach. And inshaAllah, all of these three things are now coming together in many communities in the West. And inshaAllah, this is a great bishara, good news, inshaAllah, that ulama will start to appear to lead the communities in the coming 2 or 3 generations. We've been through a difficult period. Our pessimism has been based on the experience basically of a migrant generation that has not been able to import ulama that have been able to speak to the new generation. But that period is now passing. Increasingly, ulama are returning from the Muslim world or are beginning to be trained here in the West who are bridging that gap. And once that has been achieved, once the message that is coming from the minbar is in tune with the way in which the young generation of Muslims has been acculturated now into modern Europe or modern America, then inshallah Islam will spread like wildfire because it will be accessible and people are thirsty for Islam. Islam addresses precisely the gaps in the human experience that the West is complaining of. And we need to convey this message, and that conveyance is the process of education. So inshallah, may Allah grant a pure intention and grant the necessary resources and grant worthy students to all of those who are seeking to revive the great traditions of classical Islamic education in the West. This is a process whose importance cannot be underestimated, because on its success or failure really hinges, as far as we can see, and the future is in Allah's hands, the future success and salvation of the Western countries themselves. That's not an exaggeration. That is, those are the stakes for which we are playing. So may Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala crown with success the efforts of all of those who are striving for the resuscitation of classical Islamic education in the modern world. وآخر دعوانا أن الحمد لله تعالى رب العالمين.